It's really difficult for me to put Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia into just a few words. It's a film that in many ways defies description through just how much is packed into this thing. Contrary to what many people will argue, Magnolia is without a doubt an epic. A film that presents itself on a scale only comparable to something like 2001: A Space Odyssey or Lawrence of Arabia. While, sure, topically it's not focusing on the origins of humanity through time and space or the world-changing revolts against the Ottoman Empire during World War I, although I have to say that would be interesting. It instead focuses on the drama of human life with a weight and authenticity that few have been able to achieve ever since. However, Magnolia wasn't always this way from the start. After the major success of Boogie Nights in 1997, New Line Cinema presented Anderson with the rare opportunity to make his next project anything he wanted with full backing support from the studio. Being that expectations were already very high for his next film, Anderson decided to write something much shorter and more intimate for his follow-up. He figured if he was able to shoot and get something out quickly, he'd be able to cut off the high expectations before they blew out of proportion. And you know, I think he... What started as a simple idea quickly spiraled into something considerably larger in the writing stage, with new characters leading to newer ones and an eventual script that would act as a grand portrait of American society in the San Fernando Valley, dealing with heavy themes of estrangement, abuse, regret, sickness, fate, love, basically everything regarding the human condition, but viewed through the lens of parental relationships, following very nicely with the recurring thematic sentiments that were established in Anderson's past two films. Now, story-wise, how do I even start with this one? The film has 8 fully packed main stories to keep up with here, all taking place on a rainy day in the San Fernando Valley. There isn't really one linear story that starts and ends, rather fragments of smaller ones that are connected by the film's thematic thread, and explaining them all can get confusing. Okay, so Philip Baker Hall plays a legendary quiz show host who has an estranged daughter which connects with Melora Walters' Claudia character, but doesn't intersect with John C. Reilly's Jim Curring, a pivotal character in Claudia's story. He does, however, intersect with Jeremy Blackman's Stanley Spector, who plays a quiz kid in Gator's show. A character who was in Gator's show, yes, past tense, is William H. Macy's Donnie Smith, who kinda sorta crossed paths with Philip Baker Hall. I only say past tense because he was on the show. However, in the film, Gator is played by Thomas Jane as the younger version of himself who is played by Philip Baker Hall in the future. Or I guess present. In the film. Then there's Tom Cruise as Frank T.J. Mackey, a god for misogynists everywhere who we come to find out has intensely potent daddy issues from Jason Robards' Earl Partridge. These come to intersect, as well as Julianne Moore's Linda Partridge, which, trust me, I will get to. Anyway, all of these stories eventually kinda sorta collide when a bunch of frogs start randomly at the same time, which leads to everyone's narrative climax and eventual resolution. Oh, and PTA makes a cameo here. Yeah, this narrative style really has the potential to turn into a tangled up, overcrowded projectile vomit of a story if put into the wrong hands, but thankfully, that wasn't the case at all. In terms of casting, everybody's here. You've got your returning collaborators like Philip Baker Hall, Melora Walters, and Julianne Moore mixed in with newcomers like Jeremy Blackman, Jason Robards, and Tom Cruise. It really is the PTA equivalent of an Infinity War. The individual stories here unfortunately aren't what I would consider consistent in terms of quality. However, the brisk pace of the narrative and edit make all of these weaker moments more than bearable. Tom Cruise as Frank T.J. Mackey in particular is the real standout, as I think his story and character feel like the most fleshed out and emotionally resonant with the film's main themes. Cruise just oozes this ultra-dominant, stress-inducing intensity that few actors have, and it works perfectly with Mackey's alpha He-Man persona. The complexities of his character don't just start and end there, however. Through the film's running time, we begin to slowly peel away at his true identity, eventually revealing a scared little boy filled with anger towards his abusive father. In my eyes, he's easily the best character in the film and one of PTA's best, period. I just find every artistic attempt to engage me emotionally with him work exceptionally well, better than any other story in the film. To me, he has the perfect arc, one with strong emotional elements that build and build into an incredibly moving and powerful payoff. And the strength of this is intensified even more with the companion story of his father, Earl Partridge. Legendary actor Jason Robards takes the role of Frank's estranged father, Earl, a man Julian filled to the brim with regret as he slowly dies away from cancer and wishes for the chance to see his son one last time. His caretaker Phil, played perfectly as always by Philip Seymour Hoffman, tends to Earl for the last leg of his life as his gold digger wife Linda Partridge, played by Julianne Moore, grapples with her own past sins. Earl, like his son, is such a good character, and while yes, his story isn't really new or unique in any sort of groundbreaking way, this is easily one of the most powerful and dramatic versions of the story I've ever seen. This is exemplified with Earl's final speech in the film, where he explains to Phil the deeply regretful treatment of his son and wife. The direction, the performance, everything about this sequence is absolutely heartbreaking and truly and honestly one of my favorite movie scenes ever. It's particularly touching when you realize that this was actually Jason Robards' final on-screen performance before he passed the following year from cancer. To have this be your last film role is honestly well-deserved because it stands as one of his best. There are plenty of other great stories here, like Melora Walters' Claudia, which is maybe the most sympathetic of all the stories, or John C. Reilly's Jim Curring, which provides a much-needed lighter counterbalance to an otherwise dour and moody film. But not everything here is peachy. There are stories here that unfortunately fail in living up to the high standards of others. I'm mainly talking about William H. Macy's Donnie Smith and Julianne Moore's Linda Partridge, both stories that just kind of feel like afterthoughts in comparison to everything else. Donnie, while played well by Macy, just doesn't interest me nearly as much as the other characters in the film. While his story is certainly filled with golden moments and a satisfying ending, I just don't feel any sort of emotional pull for most of his on-screen moments. His story just isn't really explored in any of the deep ways that the strongest here are. Everything with him is just so on the surface, it makes me not really feel much of anything, even in situations where I, as a viewer, am clearly supposed to. Then we get to Julianne Moore as Linda Partridge, a gold digger who is now in the unique situation of falling in love with the man she never loved as he rests on his deathbed. And look, I'm just gonna say it now, I do not like Julianne Moore in this film. Look, I thought she was incredible in Boogie Nights, among many other fantastic roles. It's just that this is not it. This is not it. I do think it could just be a matter of the character writing from PTA not being up to snuff in this case, but Julianne Moore is the only character in this film I just flat out don't believe. She spends the entire movie running around yelling at people with the exact same emotion. She's clearly supposed to be angry, but the fact that she isn't able to articulate this with any sense of nuance and instead resorts to swearing about 80% of her dialogue, by the 10th F-bomb it just begins to feel empty, especially when sandwiched between many of the other incredibly rich and well-performed characters in the film. While Linda Partridge should probably detract from my experience a little more than she actually does, I do think she highlights the real difference between what makes a character in Magnolia strong and what makes one weak in terms of quality. She and Donnie just aren't treated with the same attention to depth that the strongest like Frank and Earl are. Even though right now I prefer the more exuberant stylistic choices of his early career, there's no denying that he would greatly improve later with characters, showing restraint and focusing on much more individual portraits, like for example his next film Punch Drunk Love with Barry Egan, or what many consider his masterpiece There Will Be Blood with Daniel Plainview, or even his newest film Licorice Pizza with Alana Kane. These demonstrate a clear growth from Magnolia's handling of characters, and make this feel like a step that was necessary to achieve greater things. There are also plenty of memorable side characters here that are worth mentioning too, like Luis Guzman as Luis, my boy Alfred Molina as Solomon, yes, that's his name, I don't even know. And maybe the oddest side character of all, Emmanuel Johnson as Dixon, a character who was originally written to be part of the main cast, but was cut down to a side character instead. The reasons for this are still unknown, but it may have just been as simple as the material not shaping up to PTA's liking, or the story feeling too bloated with its inclusion. Depending on the day, I see this decision as a good thing or a bad thing. I ultimately can't really decide. On one hand, it feels like exactly what it is, a story that was trimmed out of the film and kinda just feels misplaced, while on the other hand, he can feel like a purposeful and interpretive prophet that personifies the film's opening thesis on chance and coincidence. I really don't know, and maybe with more time I'll be able to have a more solid idea as to what I ultimately think about this, but right now, I can do with or without it. The rest of the main stories here range from pretty good to just okay, but because they're spread so far out from each other with such a quick pace, I can't really say these along with Linda and Donnie drag the film that far down for me. Regardless, PTA steers this monumental 3-hour Titanic of a movie with such confidence. It never feels like it's losing my attention, even in those moments that I'm not particularly fond of. The style of Magnolia feels like a proper evolution from Boogie Nights. Its 70s cocaine-fueled roughness is not as present for the most part, but its kinetic, non-stop energy is still here in spades, accompanied by returning collaborator John Bryan and newcomer Amy Mann's wonderful score, combining with the visuals to flow like a giant synergized symphony of sorts. And just a fun fact, it was actually the Amy Mann song that jump-started the entire writing process for Magnolia, coming from the opening lines of her song, Definitely. Yeah, the stylistic influences of Martin Scorsese and Jonathan Demme are still here and very noticeable, but the film is able to separate itself enough from those to still keep me loving it. Now, the influence of Robert Altman, however, is pretty difficult to argue against, especially with his 1993 film Shortcuts in mind, which has a lot of similar ideas to Magnolia. Both films are giant character ensembles that focus on the small lives of people in the suburbs. Both films have at least one character story that focuses on a broken parental relationship, and most notably, both have a city-shaking event at the end that connects every character together in the moment. I can see it being a point of criticism for Magnolia, but the film's quality and artistically unique PTA stamp of approval keep it from being in the shadow of its influences. Do films like Kill Bill or Hereditary suck because of their similarities to films that they base themselves off of? Not in my opinion, they don't. What matters is what they say and how they say it that makes all the difference to me. To go back to the film's symphonic presentation, editor Dylan Tichenor and PTA's work here on the edit is incredible, maybe the best thing about the movie. With how many variables there are to keep track of in this film, it's a real testament to their talents that nothing here feels out of place with the film's swift, seamless rhythm. I mean, right from the beginning, a fast, blood-pumping show of anecdotes that ready us for what's to come, the pace never slows down. For 3 hours. Never! The odd choice to have both John Bryan and Amy Mann separately creating their own scores for the film and then slapping them together also works surprisingly well. Bryan goes the route of creating a score that treads the operatic in the theatrical, creating an aura of grandiosity and drama throughout its use in the film, while Amy Mann, on the other hand, takes a completely different route, reusing and writing a slew of new songs that contrast heavily with that of John Bryan's, but function incredibly well in the context of Magnolia. This unusual concoction of musical ingredients really works in embracing the unabashedness and sincerity of human life, while staying consistent and creating a unique musical identity for the film. The one musical sequence that really sticks out to me, and I imagine everyone else, is the seemingly out-of-nowhere sing-along to Amy Mann's song Wise Up at the end of the film's second act. Now, I've heard a lot about this sequence from critics and audiences alike, with many pointing to it as a complete misfire in the narrative, while others cherish it for what it brings. Me? I kinda love it. It not only works as a much-needed breather after the constant emotional storm that is the second act, but it also plays as a moment of catharsis for everybody, audience included. I mean, there was a lot going on before this moment. The extremely heartbreaking scene with Jason Robards I mentioned earlier was right before this, so we definitely needed this. And really, it's just something that's different, something that's memorable. I love when a film is able to successfully separate itself from everything else with something risky and creative like this. That's not to say I don't understand its criticisms, they just don't personally affect me in the same way as they do for others. For me, it's one of the highest emotional points and what I immediately think about in my love for this film. But if you thought the sing-along wasn't divisive enough, I think it's time we talk about the elephant in the room. Or should I say, no, I'm not gonna say it. From the beginning, weather cards are laid all throughout the film, almost as a way to mark chapters of the narrative. They add a strong feeling of imminence, like something, we're not quite sure what, is coming. And after what looks to finally be the end of the literal and figurative storm of rain and emotions, we get frogs. Raining frogs. And it's f***ing awesome. I've seen a lot of different reactions to this narrative turn online, even more so than the Wise Up sequence. What's interesting about this, however, is that most people love it and hate it for the same exact reasons. While yes, there are small hints of this event earlier in the film through the prologue and microscopic details in the background, there's really no way you could possibly predict something like this before it happens. It just inexplicably does without any rhyme or reason. That can rub some people the wrong way, but that's exactly why I love it.
Oh, the frogs falling from the sky.
Legendary film critic Roger Ebert does a fantastic job of articulating why this works so well in his 2000 review for Magnolia. Quote,
"This event is not cheating, as some critics have argued, because the prologue fully prepares the way for it, as do some subtle references to Exodus. It works like the hand of God, reminding us of the absurdity of daring to plan. And yet plan we must, because we are human, and because sometimes our plans work out."
And that's exactly it. There's something so innately human about the ways life can really us over sometimes. But the really amazing part about it is, we always find a way out of it. These significant moments stay with us for what they bring after. In Magnolia's case, it's a new perspective, a mended relationship, a broken one, and on and on and on. And look, that's not to say, hey, just throw some random shit to everything because whoop-de-doo, that's life. It works in Magnolia because of its surrounding narrative context. While it certainly feels out of nowhere, it also feels like it couldn't have gone any other way. Pretty awesome, huh? And that's the interesting thing about Magnolia. It's a film that's divisive because it's an artist taking a risk. Something that I always respect, even if the film isn't necessarily to my liking. Its philosophy on life, that it's completely out of our control, whether that be the families that we're stuck with, frogs falling from the sky, or most importantly, the past that we are given, is something that I deeply believe in. Trauma, disease, heartbreak, this is all stuff that shapes us to be the people we are. It's like Donnie Smith says.
And the book says we may be through with the past, but the past is not through with us.
By the end of the film, we see our deeply flawed characters come to terms with who they are. Frank has been given closure with his father, Stanley has learned to stand up for himself, and Claudia and Jim have found each other in a world where that just doesn't seem possible. These characters are people, broken people. And in a world where that doesn't seem possible, we're given a sign of hope. Hope to improve. To not get through the past, but to learn to live with it. And so it goes, and so it goes.
It struck me down a gradient, like Peter Pan.